If you were going to build a plant in 10 years and you're doing your feed today, you better have the technology you want to use already demonstrated and at least acceptably qualified for you to consider it as an investment in a billion and multi-billion-dollar plant. So when we talk of 2025 and it's 2015 beginning, guess where we are in having to have technology already ripe to be considered for a 2025 plant's construction? We're late. That's not what I'm here to talk about, but I couldn't avoid the opportunity to just recognize that. I was asked, and I'm standing in for Mark Northam, the director of the School of Energy Resources, to speak a little about coal to chemicals. Don't worry, we're not going to get down into the equations of state and chemical compositions. I'll just try to give you some example. What I'd like to think about first is, as we think about coal in most conversations in the U.S., we think about electricity. When we think about the largest use of coal, and pretty much most of the use of Wyoming coal, it's about electricity. So we don't think naturally about chemicals, although when we speak about gasification, we think about chemicals as one of the byproducts, yet gasified coal is a major feedstock for chemical plants like DuPont, Dow, Eastman, and especially in the United States, Eastman has a major plant that relies largely on coal to methanol as a feedstock into their, plus a form of CO, carbon monoxide they get out of it. I would like to just give us a little perspective on things in general, and got me, I have to make my time here. So present use is largely electricity. That's what we think about. I'd like to maybe get you to think about other alternatives. Electricity is a low value when you're talking about pennies per kilowatt. The margin is small. When you think about we're selling coal by the ton, we can buy topsoil for more than it costs coal. If you have to buy a couple of yards of topsoil for your yard, you pay more per ton of that equivalent than you do for a ton of coal. But coal has tremendous value. China is rapidly using coal in meeting their needs because they don't have the resources of oil and natural gas to the same degree developed, able to distribute, and probably not per capita available. So they have to import. They have a lot of coal. They use coal. Everybody know what PVC is, PVC pipes that. 20% of the PVC in the world comes from China. Coal is their feedstock of choice to produce that PVC that we buy. It also is liquid fuels, fischer-tropes, diesel. They have gasoline chemical conversions. I put India and Germany down. Germany has a coal company, a coal chemical company that's been in business for 130 years, Rutgers, and it is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. It uses coal not from gasification, but from coking, and they use a distillate from that. India has a similar process, and in fact, they just merged, and now they have more than a multi-billion dollars, a tens of billion dollars worldwide footprint as of 2013. As we hear, the regulations in general, but especially CO2 is the most challenging regulations presently for coal to continue to be utilized. And the cost to manage CO2 is the biggest hurdle in that. If it was cheap to manage CO2, do you think we'd be concerned about the regulation? So the issue is, can we find a technology or a different use? So this is what it kind of looks like generally in using coal. I showed 3 areas. I'm going to speak of a 4th way to use it towards the end of the presentation. Gasification, indirect liquefaction. You gasify the coal most often with oxygen as a feed as well, so you have to have an air separation unit to make the oxygen to add to the plant, and the plants are fairly expensive. You come off with a syngas. You can make fertilizer, urea. You can go through an indirect liquefaction and make diesel, fischer-tropes diesel, you've probably heard spoken. Naphtha is a tremendous feedstock, is important in the chemical industry. You can go from that syngas also to methanol. At University of Wyoming, we have an individual, Dr. Fan, who has developed a new catalyst for converting of syngas to methanol. The Chinese convert huge quantities of syngas to methanol. Their catalysts have to operate at about 500 C, 500 degrees centigrade. His operates at room temperature. Of course, it's only bench scale, but it has great promise and there's already great interest in it. and then dimethyl ethers, and they go into olefins and other plastics and feedstocks. Direct liquefaction is not well received in the United States. This was done years ago. In fact, the precursor technology that the Chinese used was a development in the United States under DOE funding and industry. It was sold to the Chinese. They also bought some technology from the Germans, and they integrated them and came up with a new approach, or a modified, or a stepchild of those two other processes, and they do direct liquefaction. And in fact, what they do is they bring an indirect liquefaction and a direct liquefaction plants together, and in square miles, not square acres or hectares, they build a plant. Some of you may have been over to see some of these plants. I have. They're very impressive. And what they do is the things that are waste or potentially environmental problems out of direct liquefaction feed into the indirect liquefaction, and things out of the indirect liquefaction are useful in the direct liquefaction process. And so they, as we used to say back in Pennsylvania, you use everything but the oink on the pig. It's kind of the same idea. And then there's the coking process. Most of us have probably heard of coking more by way of feedstock into the steelmaking process, which is true, but it also comes off with distillates, and tar is that, and that has tremendous use, as you see over to the right there. So that's about as technical as we're going to get in this conversation. I'll give you a little perspective on China. And this chart, while the red on, it showed better on my computer, sorry about that, is basically, if you look at the top, the blue top there, that's the different stages of coming into a large-scale industry. And the creation of an industry is kind of where we might be in Wyoming right now, and a little bit of pioneering in that we have some chemical plants being considered or being developed from gasification, and some chemical process actually taking place in the state. You can see a large portion of China is in that area, and there are success factors of the R&D coming out. The volume growth is also where they have moved into now. They make huge quantities and use thousands and actually millions of tons of coal in their processes. And where they want to be is where they are now really entering is the portfolio growth, where they can make more and different types of chemicals and utilization of coal or other feedstocks. Now, we're interested in coal on this particular conversation, but obviously biomass can be added with the coal where it's appropriate. Last time I looked, biomass is not a huge Wyoming product. Although some would suggest, and I have to be careful, since the legislative session's in process, there is biomass possibly being formulated. That's a joke. You go from there into maturity, and China hasn't entered the maturity level yet, but they are growing rapidly to it. Now, if we're thinking about doing coal to chemicals in a larger scale here, is there room for us? So I'll talk about that a little bit later after we look at a few other things. My simple answer is yes, going back to some of what Ben said earlier and part of what the governor said. We have over 1 billion people in the world don't have electricity. Almost 2 billion people in the world don't really have clean water. We have a lot of room for things that we take for granted to be in need and are growing in demand as people get the access to TV and internet. Even for short periods of time, they get an appetite. And once they have an appetite and they realize there's things out there, I'll give you a little side story. I worked with some people in another state a long time ago in my life, and I used to go there and I'd come back with certain things when I go back to the state, I'd have them. And they said, well, why do you bring that stuff? What do they have out there that we don't have? And the person that said that, daughter got married to somebody and went to live in another area of the country. And when she went there to visit her daughter took her where she goes shopping for groceries. And guess what? She came back with a carload of stuff that she couldn't get where she is. That's not a prejudicial discussion about where she lived. It's just that lots of times we don't know what's possible or what's available if we haven't been exposed to it. I can say this, but please don't call my wife and say this. Somebody once asked her, did she need anything from the store? And I said she hasn't been there to see yet. Which I certainly got a tap on the shoulder. That was not necessary. But if you get the point is, we're all the same. I'll be surprised when I get a list to go and do some shopping, how many things that aren't on a list come home in my cart. I happen to see them. Why didn't you tell me they had this? So, going back to the subject, if Wyoming wants to do it, I would say we're somewhere in the creation to pioneering phase of actually doing it. The good news is we have technological wherewithal that we can tap and develop upon and have unique applications, and we have certain opportunities because of the resources of the state that could actually be utilized and are being taken advantage on some of the initiatives that are taking place in the state right now. So I just want to say this is a number of projects in China in each of these. It's coal to olefins is the left column, coal to monoethylene glycol is the next one, coal to liquids, read that as fuel, is the next one, and coal to synthetic natural gas, and you see how large that is. That's because they have such a dearth of natural gas, they're going to make synthetic natural gas. Now, we have a natural gas plant in North Dakota. You know, Dakota Gasification makes synthetic natural gas. The problem is at the present price of natural gas, if they weren't selling the CO2 that they make with it, they would be in the red. But with the price of CO2 and the demand for it, they are actually making money profitably. They're definitely deep in the black. My only point of putting this up is they've got a lot of projects, and none of these projects are 1,000-ton-a-day projects. They're all, you know, tens of thousands of tons a day or more projects. That's a lot of coal. These are all based on coal as the feedstock. This is looking at the gasification. This is a GE slide, and it basically looks at the world from a standpoint of market drivers. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner, it says the United States. To gasify coal in the United States for anything but a high-value product is probably not going to get much lift because we have a lot of surplus natural gas and we have, you know, a lot of oil. So we have precursors to various applications, but obviously for electricity, gasification really struggles to be cost competitive. And I'm a big fan of Kemper, and I've worked in relationship to technology that was developed and utilized there during part of my career. And I'm a big, you know, the HECA project in California, I've been involved with the Summit project. You know, I subscribe to what they're doing. The marketplace makes it very hard when natural gas is at the price point it is right now. One of the questions is, will it stay there? I would submit that the low price is reducing the potential to stay there, and if we stay much longer at this price, we're going to not be producing what we could produce, and we'll have a big lag at regaining the ability to produce the same quantity, so the price of gas will come back up again. It's just market-driven. It's not a bad or good. The other thing is, I know for a fact that there are a lot of people that are in the fracking and drilling phase that are probably really struggling, and you probably read in the papers about people laying off part of their crew, the number of rigs that are standing idle and growing. Well, most of those rigs, especially the new ones, were built on loan. In other words, they borrowed money to build it with an expectation the market would continue to do it. When it's sitting idle, they're still having to pay their debt. So I just put that out there as a dynamic that's going to come back around and be a challenge. The problem for us in coal generation is 10 years. If somebody said, we need a gigawatt of coal, we'll tell them we can deliver it in 10 years. A new plant, I mean. Can they wait 10 years? You want to wait 10 years with the lights off at your house? I can get a natural gas combined cycle plant up for 3 or 4 years. From the time I decide, go through the permitting and put it up. As long as I have a transmission line nearby, I have gas as well as a transmission line with electricity out. So chemicals is another area of looking. If you look at some of the others, they have, if you look at South America, I'm not going to belabor this chart, it's going to be available to you. South America has a lot of pet coke. We actually have a lot of pet coke on, where the refineries are on the West Coast. It gets shipped to China. The good news for the Californians is all the emissions embedded in the pet coke floats back across the Pacific as it gets used. So they get rid of the pet coke, but they get the aerosols and benefits that are negative. So I said, can China keep going? The biggest issue in the way of China being able to go much faster on expanding their coal to chemicals is water and the competing needs for water. Other industries need water, the agricultural needs water, and people need water. I don't know how many of you watched the Olympics in China quite a while ago now. You probably don't realize that all the farms 150 miles around Beijing were shut down during the Olympics so there would be sufficient water. You know, we saw all the fountains and stuff. They shut and didn't do any farming in those farms for a year or 2 years, I think. So they would have sufficient water to provide Beijing with what it needs. Now, where you're in China, the government can just decide there's going to be, you're out of business for the next 2 years. Well, what am I going to eat? I don't know. We'll have to find you something. You can just move 1,000 miles across country. We'll get you a job over there temporarily. And that's, in fact, part of what happened. So my point is, they have a huge challenge in water. Now, part of that is by treating water better, they can get more use out of it. But part of it's just the total availability of water is not there. And they have a growing demand for their own chemicals. But the rest of the world has a growing demand for chemicals, and the rest of the emerging nations as well. So we would have a potential market not just for chemicals if we pick the right ones in the United States, but also elsewhere in the world. So instead of shipping coal at tens of dollars per ton, we may be shipping chemicals at hundreds of dollars a ton. And I'll give you an example of some of the chemicals that come out in a little while. By the way, I'm strongly an advocate for carbon capture and sequestration, so this is not about that, because we still got to deal with CO2. This is just to remind you there's another process. I mentioned earlier the coking process. It provides the coal tar that comes out of the coking process. You generate the coke, which goes mainly to the steel and aluminum industries. The coal tar goes out through a distillation tower, goes into coal pitch, which goes into all these things on the right. The big aluminum smelters, the anode, big electrode that goes in the bauxite to melt it and make it aluminum. Coal tar is the large contributor to the formulation of that anode. You can go down lithium-ion batteries, graphite, electric dyes and organic materials, all the way down. I'm not going to read the whole list. Carbon black, which is for tire industry. Your tires are black. Carbon black is not just there to make them black, but it's also there for structural benefit in the rubber. I just threw this in there. This is the Rutgers upper left-hand corner and Rain International, which is India. They merged. These are some of their product lines. I'm not going to read it. It's just pretty much a placekeeper. So if you want to look at it after the talk, you can see. You can go on the website and look them up and see just how big it is. So this is a slide directly from the School of Energy Resources. We are looking at initiating, and we have already initiated because I mentioned the one on the catalyst, but we're looking at the coal refinery, looking at using coal in beyond electricity manner. And we already know you can do a lot of this stuff through gasification, but what a refinery does is they take the crude oil and they crack it, and they put it through distillation. This is oversimplified, obviously. And they pull different things out of it as some of the products that come off on the side there you can see. A coal refinery is possible. It's been done. We need to do it at scale. This is one that's worked at bench scale actual. And sorry if it's harder to read than I realized, but it comes off with several major things. So the engineering projection for doing a 1,400 ton per day Powder River Basin coal plant would make out of that 950 tons per day of benzene, or BTX, whose value is about $600 a ton, 230 tons a day of naphtha, whose value is about $400 a ton. I'm using modern, present-day numbers, round numbers. 2,350 tons per day of number 4 fuel oil, that's heavy fuel oil. 210 tons per day of ammonia, 540 tons a day of methane, about half of which goes back in with the coal feed that comes in from the top and goes through the cracker. 4,400 tons per day of char, which is worth about $60 a ton. The point of me throwing out the numbers and the tons per day out of 1,400 tons of Powder River Basin coal is, if you think about 1,400 tons of Powder River Basin coal and what it's worth, sale on the rail car, and when I just mentioned prices per ton of the products that could be realized from that, and all those prices come out of that same product. It's not like you pick one of them. You may be able to shimmy it a little more one way or the other, but you wind up getting those out. Comes down the cracker, it goes through a cyclone which moves basically the discard, and the char, and it goes up a distillate column, and it basically at different temperatures brings off different gases, which then liquefy, and that's where your products come out, your benzene and other, and you have it on the right. It's doable. You know, we've used some numbers to guesstimate, and I say guesstimate because when you're interpreting engineering and bench scale things, we'd like to do a 30 to 50 ton per day unit with a commercial partner. This technology has been patented, and actually the Chinese have licensed the patent to look at doing it. But unfortunately, the way that works is, you know, they kind of license, they go off and do their thing, and after they get as much as they need, they go off and try to go further without as much communication. So the point of this conversation is, hopefully some conversation, that we need to think about coal beyond electricity, but not necessarily in spite of electricity or instead of electricity. We need to look at coal for other ways it can be used. Oh, one other little thing about this particular approach, in gasification you get CO2. Because most gasification is done in an oxygen-rich, because that's what the oxygen feed is in there for, so you move the carbon fully over because you want the energy out of it. This is done in an oxygen-starved or reducing approach. So you come out with carbon monoxide and methane, which you reform about half the methane and send it in as CO, additional CO, and H2, hydrogen, to go down the stream with the new coal that's about 100 micron ground coal. And I used 1,400 tons per day, Powder River Basin, figuring about 400 tons of that 1,400 is basically ash and, you know, things that you really don't convert anything from that winds up in the bottom with the char and the composite. So I hope I've given you just a tickle on maybe thinking about other things to do with Powder River Basin coal besides electricity. Not instead of electricity, but if electricity is going down in demand as far as coal, we have some coal available. Maybe we want to look at doing something along this line to realize it. The other thing about this is you would ship a higher value product out by car, by tank car, than the coal car carries. So that would take up some of the problem on the over demand on the railroad systems presently. And some of this would actually go in pipelines as well. With that, I'm open to some questions. Mike?
Yep, thanks, Carl. Just want to tell you, appreciate your presentation, and probably the only board member that could ask a question that could come close to stumping you would be Don. So
well, Don can probably
both Dave and I are going to defer our proxy to Don for a tough question, or maybe even just a good question for you.
Well, thanks, Mike. Well, I don't think Carl's stumpable. Very sharp guy, and really thank you for all your help you've done in the state of Wyoming for many years, serving, you know, Friedenthal and the Wyoming Energy Resource Council, and helping start thinking about all these things even before you came to Wyoming, to looking ahead to those big challenges and trying to get people focused on that before it really hits, you know, the cliff that we're facing, that Ben talked about. So really your help and service that Mike talked about earlier to the state has been tremendous. So in terms of a good question, I guess, when will we have this ready?
Well, technically speaking, it's ready to do some scale up. But being more of a systems engineer, I would say the system development really hasn't been done. Really, the reactor's been tested bench scale. The gas that comes off has been able to be separated. The technology for distillate column is established pretty well. But how you marry that all up and get an ongoing production system requires getting up in at least a 30 ton per day to start to really see what are the issues as far as marrying the process and the time. The residence time for this it's a gravity feed reactor, but it operates about at 600 C and about 9 atmospheres of pressure. So it feeds from the top through a lock hopper process, but and it also is a grinder for grinding the coal to 100 micron mesh. But it could be done at probably within a year or two of funding available. And funding available would be, depending on scale, whether we do 30 or 50, somewhere between probably $7 and $10 million to do that unit.
Well, probably the question I see as the biggest barrier is the whole.
And I'm not speaking on behalf of the university when I say that, because
Yeah.
this has got, I'm not looking for the university to get the money necessarily.
So probably the real hard question is how do we get through the regulatory and policy barriers so we can do this faster? So hopefully Julio and Joe Goffman can talk about that at lunch. We see China, who doesn't have those things.
That's
And
right.
We see it in the electronics and software where acceleration and disruptive technology is getting faster and faster and faster, and yet that kind of benefit is not happening in the energy sector, especially in the U.S., but we're seeing it in places like China. So it indicates it can be done. So the hard question is, how do we change that culture in the U.S. so we can be as fast or faster?
Well, I'll give you an answer that a senior member of a Chinese company who was involved with FutureGen when I was involved with FutureGen quite a while ago, and I would ask him what he thought about it after we'd gone through the third set of complaints about the NEPA process. And I said, so what do you think about your year in the United States? He looked at me, he said, too much freedom. I said, too much freedom, what do you mean? He said, in China, we talk about it, we argue about it, we look at the facts, we decide. In the United States, we talk about it, we argue about it, we think we decide, and then somebody says, no, I want to revisit everything again, and then we revisit everything again. So it went from, we can do this in a year, we can get to a point of design. On the other side of the coin, I really think, the governor said something I thought was really important to realize. Regulations are important. Too many times technology is developed and we then think about the regulations. And I think what we have to try to do, and that's why a proper approach to regulations provides opportunity for technical response versus a chill to the marketplace because of too aggressive. And if you look at the old Clean Air Act involvement of regulations, they came in stair steps of improvement so that there was a potential for commercial investment and realization of return. And then before it got more stringent, there had been time to develop the next set of technology answers to that tighter constraint. So if we can do that, then I think people can design to do those kind of things. On this particular unit that I'm talking about, I think we can meet most of the regulations pretty readily, and it doesn't make, probably about less than 5% of the carbon gets converted to CO2 in this particular down reactor in the reducing, because there's no oxygen to convert it to CO2, and the CO will actually go into some of the chemicals that come out of it. So it's a way, in one sense, to get a higher value product for actually less complication and without having to manage the CO2 issue, because we manage the carbon in a different way. This goes back into carbon management. How do we manage the carbon? Not, if you think about it, if anybody thinks that they can't live without carbon, they should shoot themselves because they're all made of carbon. Your clothes are made of carbon. If you got synthetic garments on, you still have carbon because the plastics came out of carbon-based feedstock. I mean, carbon is the essential component of life in this part of the universe that we live in. So it's not about carbon, it's about managing how we use it to avoid problems from it. So that's not a really very straightforward answer, but it's the best answer I think we have with the realities that regulations are here, we have to work with them. Having said that, there are abilities, especially when you work with the government, to get waivers for certain experiments to try something out, assuming that they're not going to be drastic to the environment and those around it. You don't get long-term, but you get an opportunity to prove something and determine what the issues might be. And those are one of the ways we can go forward. Sorry.
Have you, forecast out the evolution, go back, to some of the life cycle of, volume and production and commercialization? Assume everything works and is beautiful and does all this great stuff. What's the scale and the impact of this from an industry and a forecast standpoint? Is there enough access to a market that's going to be able to have significant uptake?
I mean, I haven't done a real market survey. I've done quite a bit of reading of the marketplace. There's always the price of the chemicals right now certainly continues to indicate the market demand is there. the volume availability. And part of it is the general economy going healthy enough for people to use the product of the marketplace. But the simple answer to your question is, yeah, I believe there's the marketplace for us to use, millions of tons of coal, not maybe as much as we mine right now, but certainly a large portion of that. Let's just take a number and say 20% equivalent of our total production in the state could go to chemicals. That'd be a pretty nice number, especially when you figure the value proposition is substantially higher. The margins are higher. One of the problems when you're an energy producing state and you sell your energy in its raw form, California takes our natural gas, right? I think we provide 18% of California's natural gas from Wyoming. They use it for various things, including electricity, but they also use it for higher value products. So their GDP return on that gas is much higher than our GDP return on the gas. That makes sense to everybody? It means like if I can do a truck garden in my backyard and I go sell them, I'm not going to sell them for just the number of hours and cost of the seed. I'm going to sell them for more and hopefully make more on them. If somebody's going to can them and sell the canned goods for more than they paid for the tomatoes, that kind of thing. So I think you have to ask the question a little differently. Even if we couldn't use all the coal we produce, if we could use a substantial part of it and the value return to the state was 2 orders of magnitude higher than the total value of all the coal we've sold per year, that would be a good thing for the state. It would possibly be easier, depending on the process, to be more environmentally benign as well. The chemical industry is pretty staunchly driven to be responsible, especially in the United States.
I guess I'm running out of time, but maybe just add to that, Carl, because I think it's a really good strategic discussion. And that's being able to do this value-added industry processing in the state of Wyoming. I was talking to the governor about a month ago, adds a whole nother other value component to the state where we invest a lot in our youth through the Hathaway Scholarship to go to junior colleges, community colleges, University of Wyoming, and yet we export that educated youth to operate and work in other states and enhance the economies and GDP of those states. Having the ability to do the value-added processing in state and have those industries and those high-quality jobs allows us to then get a return on investment for the training of our youth that is currently being largely exported. So,
yeah, thank you.
Questions from the audience? Mohammed, we have one right there.
David Wendt, Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs. Carl, you touched on the whole issue of carbon dioxide emissions in comparing coal gasification for power generation versus coal conversion, coal to olefins, coal to synthetic natural gas, coal to liquids. Could you talk a little bit about the trade-offs? It's my understanding, as far as CO2 emissions, it's my understanding that the coal conversion process produces, in general, indirect liquefaction, a purer waste stream of CO2, and so that's more beneficial. However, it's also more energy intensive, so it produces more CO2 emissions. Could you talk a little bit about those trade-offs, Carl? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good point. I try to brush on it lightly, but gasification processes, especially for power generation, but also to other chemical feedstocks, is looking for a conversion of the feedstock that they use, coal, let's say in this case, to the most efficient manner, including the capture of heat in the conversion process. The particular process I have up there is also generates heat in the process, and once it's running, it actually self-sustains itself because the heat's there to continue doing. That's why the insulation. The reality with gasification versus a combustion process right now, combustion being like how we burn coal normally versus gasifying it, is you wind up with a pure and higher concentrated CO2 feed stream that you can separate more readily, not for free. And if you're doing chemicals, you usually have to get it out of the way because it could contaminate where it's going to, whatever the catalyst or whatever the particular reaction. So you take it off anyway. You have to do something with it. Now, in the state of Wyoming, that I think the EOR Institute came out with a projection of, and of course this was a couple years ago, that we need $6 billion worth of CO2 a year to really pursue all EOR opportunities in the state over the next decade. We don't have that CO2. Having a pure stream of CO2 would be useful for the EOR world. In the chemical world, they also use CO2 for a contributor to chemical production. So if there's some cases where that CO2 becomes value in the chemical process, and it depends on the process and the products you're doing as to what you do with it. Or what they do in China, if they don't need it, is they pretty much vent it. Now, they have a need for EOR too, but they don't have the CO2 pipeline systems that we even have. So unless it's real close, they have nothing to do with it but let it go. But it does come off in a less of a challenge to separate it, I guess you'd say, than we do in a power plant of a combustion type. Does that help, David? Yeah.
Carl, let's give Carl a hand. We appreciate it. Good job.